Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Excellent line of questions. Gentlelady from California, Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Thompson, do you believe the European Union was formed to hurt America?
I do not.
Okay, I ask because the president publicly said yesterday that the European Union was formed in order to screw the United States, and even floated the idea of using military force to take Greenland from Denmark, a NATO ally, because we, quote, need it for national security. Those kinds of statements suggest a U.S. stance that our European allies and institutions are adversaries or fair game for coercion. In your view, do such positions reflect a coherent U.S. strategy toward Europe?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. What I would say is, as far as our approach to our allies and partners is one, first and foremost, of honesty. We want to be honest with our partners, and we also want to be honest about the fact that they need to step up. And that's what I was emphasizing in my testimony when I referenced the administration's priority to bring European and Canadian allies within NATO to 5%. And we've already seen great strides in that process, and then also have our European allies lead out, particularly on the future of security assistance to Ukraine. And I would also underscore that Denmark and our bilateral relationship with Denmark is certainly a part of that equation, and we want to have a robust security relationship there, particularly for the reasons that you identify as far as Greenland being critical to homeland defense, and we would share that view.
Okay, great. Well, it's good to know that our approach is about honesty. I guess I'm glad the president publicly, honestly said what he thinks about our European allies. Ms. Thompson, are you aware that Europe pays for 84% of NATO's infrastructure at U.S. bases, and that Poland is spending over $300 million annually to support U.S. troops directly?
I am certainly aware of Europe's contributions to NATO, for at least on the defense side. I know there's different streams of funding for defense contributions or for NATO contributions on the state side as well.
Okay, and so how do you square that with calling them free riders?
So I think the commentary that I made, and then certainly that the administration has made, really stems from this chronic underspending of being under the 2% threshold. The Wales Pledge in 2014 was made in a security environment that was arguably a lot more secure than the security environment that we face today, certainly from the adversaries that the U.S. is facing. And I think from that perspective, there's rightly placed frustration in wanting our European allies to not only meet the spending commitment that they made in 2014, but also live up to the overarching Article 3 pledge of contributing to the collective security of the alliance, which includes defense spending. And I would also argue that the security environment that we face today, as bipartisan officials have recognized across administrations, 2% as a threshold for spending is no longer sufficient to meet the demands of the security environment, which is exactly why President Trump has set the target he set. And it's really, really encouraging, I have to say, for many of our allies to now be over the 2% threshold. We want to see those timelines get pulled to the left even further, and to see them make further progress. And I would also just take the opportunity to highlight the Eastern allies who are on track to meet 5% very, very soon.
Thank you. And General Cavoli, from a military standpoint, what is the impact on our operations and partnerships when our allies hear American leaders suggest that the EU was formed to screw us, or to entertain ideas of invading an ally's territory, or for calling them free riders when they are contributing a lot to supporting our troops? How does this affect trust and cohesion among our allies that we depend on for our collective security?
Ma'am, thanks for the question. Clearly, it strays well out of my lane, but I talk to all of the chiefs of defense in Europe all the time, and our military-to-military relationships remain quite strong and are very solid, ma'am.
Have President Trump's comments come up in any of your conversations with other military leaders?
Rarely.
But have they, in the context of Europe, in this being formed to screw them, or what the president is trying to do in Greenland?
Ma'am, it's rare enough that I'm searching to be sure to give you a complete and honest answer. I can't remember an instance of that off the top of my head. You know, military guys, we really try to stay carefully to the military construct and to the military lane, because it's not our job in any of the nations in NATO. So I can't think of an example off the top of my head. If I do think of one, I'll be sure to tell you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Mesmer.
Thank you, Chairman. General Cavoli, in dealing with U.S. missile defense and President Trump's Golden Dome executive order, What may not be known is that Europe already has a U.S.-provided Golden Dome in the form of the Aegis Ashore sites in Russia, or in Romania and Poland. These missile defense systems have performed well in the Middle East, but the Aegis air defense functionality in Europe is not activated due to regional political concerns. Given the willingness of Russia to deploy novel hypersonic weapons in Ukraine, is it your best military advice that we activate these air defense capabilities to counter that threat?
Sir, I have, as the Supreme Allied Commander, made that recommendation to the North Atlantic Council.
Thank you. Also, can you explain how the missile defense architecture that we've invested in Europe could protect the U.S. homeland?
Oh, sure. So, some of the radars involved provide some of the very first warnings, and there's quite a bit more, but I think I'd be more comfortable discussing it in a closed session, sir.
Fair enough. Okay. Given the U.S. increase of the drone threats to critical infrastructure military bases in Europe, how is EUCOM planning to integrate directed energy technologies into its counter-drone defense?
First of all, we're eager to do that, Congressman, because a lot of the other kinetic solutions are pretty problematic to use, in congested areas and bases that are in congested areas. We're planning to use a layered defense and a full suite of different capabilities. Some of them electromagnetic interference, some of them directed energy, as you said, some of them just kinetic projectiles. It's important to remember that we've got to do that in close connection to civil authorities from the host nation. And each nation has different regulations for spectrum management, for the release of weapons and things like that. So we work through this daily. It's a pretty big initiative.
Would that be a more cost-effective counter measure to some of the million-dollar missiles that we use to shoot down?
DE? Yes, sir. Yeah. I mean, I think everybody's looking for that new way to shoot down aerial objects that doesn't require us to launch multi-million-dollar missiles at a $1,000 drone type of thing.
Yeah. Very good. In my district in southwest Indiana, General Cavoli, the Crane Army Ammunition Activity Mission, where nearly 25% of the DOD's conventional munitions are stored. A large amount of the equipment and munitions stored there has been withdrawn via the Presidential Drawdown Authority and sent to Ukraine. How important is it from a combat commander's perspective that we modernize and restock these munitions storage facilities?
Our stockage levels are extremely important to a combatant commander, sir, and to the extent that they're depleted by operations or by donations to another country such as Ukraine, they need to be replenished. There is a program to do that, well funded previously by the Congress, and it's an important thing for us to consider.
Okay, thank you. Also, General Cavoli, spectrum is a valuable, finite resource that's used by the DOD. There are some in Congress who want to require the DOD to vacate its spectrum allocations. Could you speak to what the impact would be on EUCOM if the DOD was forced to vacate the spectrum allocations, and what would be the effects on missile defense?
Yes, sir. So I think most of the discussion is around the S-band, and we use that. I could go in a little bit more detail in classified session, although I'm, not exactly an electrical engineer, but I could talk to you more about it in classified session. It would affect missile defense and air defense.
That would affect the potential for defending our country in Europe and the continental U.S. as well. Okay.
That's right.
Yeah. Very good. I'll yield back the rest of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you both of you for being in here today. I wanted to join my colleagues in expressing deep sympathies for the families of those service members who we lost in Lithuania. And General Cavoli, thank you for responding very rapidly and working with our allies to make sure that we had recovery operations going. And I also want to join my colleagues in thanking you for your incredible service during your tenure. You met challenges throughout Europe that we haven't seen since World War II. You did so with extreme competence, diligence, and discipline, and that was seen by many folks on the Hill as well as our allies, and we are very grateful for your leadership. Turning to Ukraine, in the initial stages of the war, the Ukrainians were able to destroy a very large percentage of the conventional land forces of Russia. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
Over half by most estimations.
Right, would have to think of it as a rolling figure because they were growing at the same time as they were losing. But yeah, those are about the kind of numbers. We're looking at about almost 4,000 tanks, Russian tanks, destroyed by Ukraine in this conflict.
But since that time, Russia has, with surprising speed, been able to recapitalize and rebuild both its industrial base, but also its conventional forces, and replace a lot of that equipment and personnel. Is that accurate?
Absolutely.
And how would you characterize China's involvement in that recapitalization, both the industrial component as well as the military component?
We could talk a lot more about this in closed session, sir, and perhaps we'll have the opportunity to. But there has been contributions. Some of them have been indirect by absorbing much of Russian-sanctioned oil exports and gas exports. They have been able to continue to provide funds that have enabled Russia to continue to build their military. Some have been more direct. Some have been through commercial ventures that may or may not be supported by the Chinese Communist Party. And beyond that, I think I'd be safest to talk to you about it in closed session, sir.
So, and we'll convene in closed session, but both directly and indirectly, economically, and to some degree militarily, China has chosen sides here.
Oh, certainly. You know, I think there's an important side note, Congressman. Sometimes I've been asked, well, they're only giving them moral support, and I typically respond, but that's the most pernicious type of support.
But it's more than moral support, would you say?
And it is.
Yes. Okay. So they have determined that it's in their interest to support Russia in this conflict.
It would appear so.
Okay. Ms. Thompson, this administration has taken a hard line on China in a number of big ways, trying to reestablish and balance that relationship. Would you agree that China has chosen sides in the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, with the caveat, right, that you highlighted, which I think is actually really, really important, in that it aligns with their interests. Insofar as perpetuating this conflict or other conflicts aligns with their interests, I think that's where we will see the adversary alignment, and that's why it's so important from the context of this administration, right, to get the work streams correct so that the U.S. can focus on deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, avoiding conflict there, while our European allies really step up.
The Chinese have determined it's in their interest to support Russia both directly and indirectly.
I would echo General Cavoli's comments. It appears so.
Okay. So given that, would you agree that it's in our interest to support Ukraine if China has determined it's in their interest to support Russia?
I would perhaps take it a step further, Congressman, depending on how you look at it, which is I think that's the impetus for trying to get to peace in Ukraine so that we don't continue to burgeon that relationship or continue to allow the interests to overlap, particularly given the situation, and I know I don't speak for Indo-PACOM, but particularly given what
you're not willing to say, though, it's in our interest to ensure Ukraine is successful in this conflict.
From our vantage point within the administration, I think that's why the prioritization imperative is placed on peace.
But the lack of ability to say that it's America's interest for Ukraine to prevail in this continues to be staggering to me, because our adversaries, our competitors, have been very clear about the sides that they have chosen here and who they think is in their best interest to prevail militarily, and yet we are unwilling to do that. And there's a lot of talk about peace through strength, but if you're not willing to actually say the thing, if you're not willing to actually call it out and take sides, I don't see how we can be strong in that regard. So I will continue to urge, along with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, that the administration is very clear in its rhetoric about who we will support here. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes another Coloradan, Mr. Crank.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. General Cavoli, thank you for being here. Most Americans probably aren't aware that some of the first shots in the Russian invasion of Ukraine were in space, when Russia knocked out a satellite network providing communication support to Ukraine. And according to a recent report, Russia is fielding new anti-satellite weapons, expanding on-orbit counter-space capabilities, and training in military space elements to combat the United States. According to General Whiting, commander of U.S. Space Command, quote, "Winning the space fight is foundational to defending the nation," unquote. Can you provide an update of the role that on-orbit warfare is playing in your theater?
Sure, Congressman, with the caveat that I think, as you know, it's really hard to talk about space operations and capabilities in open session.
Sure.
So if you'd like to talk about it a little bit more in closed session, we could. I would also refer you to General Whiting and to General Saltzman, who are genuine experts in this question. I'm a customer. I'm a consumer of their efforts. Yes, our space capabilities are absolutely essential to the way we do operations. Our adversary space capabilities are absolutely essential to the way they do operations, and they understand how important space is to us. So it is very much a contested environment, a contested capability, and I'd be delighted to talk more about it in a closed session, sir.
In your opinion, are Russia and China's space-based capabilities stronger, weaker, or the same compared to the start of the war in Ukraine?
They grow constantly. They are both working very hard to improve their capabilities and to expand their capacity, and they have been doing that with the war in Ukraine, and I imagine they would have without the war in Ukraine as well.
Okay, and then finally, in your testimony, you highlighted how USEUCOM partners with Cyber Command to, quote, deter advanced persistent threats, unquote. Can you describe where those threats come from and what they're targeting?
Yeah, there are non-governmental threats, sir, right? Criminal activity, ransomware, and things like that, that have national security implications, and so they matter to us. We help our allies with defending against those. There are also state-based threats, and each one of our main adversaries, that group of 4 that I named in my opening statement, each one of those is quite active in the cybersphere.
How can Congress help strengthen your hand in those fights?
Sir, by supporting U.S. Cyber Command, all of their subordinate organizations have relationships with the combatant commands. 16th U.S. Air Force is my cyber component for USEUCOM. That makes a big difference when you support Cyber Command. Also, when you support the National Security Agency, because that work is so closely tied to cyber work.
Thank you. I'd like to thank both of our witnesses for coming today, but for your service to our country and for all that you do to keep us safe. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Ryan from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for being here. General Cavoli, I want to add to the well-deserved praise and recognition. Couldn't imagine a more critical time for your leadership and could not imagine a better leader, and the whole country is thankful to you, and I think just want to, on behalf of my constituents in particular, thank you. Your leadership, not only as USEUCOM commander, but as SACEUR, has been indispensable. And as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, that position has a deep historical significance, starting with General and ultimately President Eisenhower as our first Supreme Allied Commander. In a way that is truly staggering to all of us, including, the chair has weighed in on this as the ranking member and many others. The plan that was floated in March to restructure combatant commands and give up U.S. command of that role, I think would be a massive step backwards. You've talked a little bit about it in front of the Senate last week. One of my colleagues from the other side of the aisle, Mr. Bacon, has said, quote, "It signals a weakening commitment to NATO, and I think it's wrong." Former SACEUR Admiral Stavridis said for the United States to give up the role of Supreme Allied Commander of NATO would be seen in Europe as a significant signal of walking away from the alliance. Can you speak a little bit about, given your unique view into that role, how would Russia and Putin specifically view us backing away from that role?
Thanks, Congressman. First of all, thanks for pointing out the role General Eisenhower had as the first SACEUR. You might imagine his likeness, his photographs, busts of him are all over the headquarters. There's one sitting behind my desk that looks over my shoulder, checking my homework every day. So if you want to feel a little bit of pressure ever, just take a job that Ike had. Big shoes to fill, indeed. Yeah, everybody relies on SACEUR. Our allies want American leadership. Our allies would like to have an American as SACEUR. From our perspective, we gain quite a bit of influence from it, right? I have a very loud voice inside Europe as a result of my position. And I think those are to our advantage. Of course, what the United States decides to do is always going to be a policy matter, and there are other considerations that our civilian leaders will take into consideration as they think about these things. What do the Russians see? You know, I think that of all the nations in the alliance, the Russians have the most respect for the strength of the U.S. military. They respect all the militaries, and especially the collective military, but we are the military that stands out as something for them to worry about. And so an officer who has the ability to command U.S. forces probably is a bigger problem for them than not.
I can only imagine, truly, what General and former President Eisenhower would think about us even considering walking away from that position. I think it's embarrassing and pathetic. Which leads me to my follow-up question for you, Ms. Thompson. Given your opening, albeit very short and heavy on buzzwords, posture statement, where you use the term factory reset, which I have no idea what that means in the context of something so critical and nuanced as what we're talking about. But given that, I wanted to ask you what you mean by that. And specifically, in January of this year, actually, January 2025, Senator Mike Lee called explicitly for the United States to leave NATO. Is that correct?
Again, I represent...
Would you know, since you were his national security advisor up through January?
I left on January 20th, 2025, so if it was after that, that was not something that I would have seen.
Well, do you think we should leave NATO then?
Again, I represent the Department of Defense. I can only speak on behalf of the Department of Defense, and Secretary Hegseth has been very clear we are not stepping away from
So what
NATO.
does he mean then, on behalf of the Department of Defense, by factory reset? Is it us walking away from the leadership of NATO, and you heard some of the consequences of that? Is it us abandoning NATO? At a minimum, if we're going to make such a major change, I know you're doing your posture review, but I think we owe the American people a transparency around something that would be so impactful to our security.
So first and foremost, on the SACIR question, if the question is the department considering that change, my definitive answer is no. Second part, on factory reset, the Secretary, in his remarks to the North Atlantic Council and to the Ukraine Defense Contract Group, was very clear that by factory reset, what we mean is returning the focus of the alliance to defense and deterrence of Europe, to the core mission, and to be frank, to Eisenhower's original mission set and call for the alliance, which is conventional defense and deterrence in Europe. Certainly that's what we are expecting of our European allies, with the U.S. as the nuclear strategic deterrent backstop as well. But factory reset really does mean returning to the core fundamental mission of the alliance, which is defense and deterrence.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes a gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Amadei.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our panel for coming today. The conflict in Ukraine is a convergence of tensions not only with Russia, but also Iran, North Korea, and China as well. Now, we have an America First mandate to first protect the homeland and to use the strength to deter war. That's a mission that the Biden administration failed to achieve. Now we are divided across the Asian, European, and Middle Eastern theaters, and we face tough choices. There simply aren't enough brave young men and women, sons and daughters, to be everywhere all at once. Now, America First doesn't mean America alone. And yet, a continent divided by Chinese and Russian economic penetration cannot stand. Now, we must seize the chance to realign our NATO commitments, defense manufacturing, and our trade policies to find new ways to make Europe's economy a denied environment for those plotting harm against America and its allies. Now, my first question is to you, Secretary Thompson. Now, we're directing immense resources to onshore defense industrial base here. And as you know, all the semiconductor industry, as well as President Trump, has really advocated in his first term, also in his second term already. And what I'm concerned about right now is at the same time, China threatens our momentum by trying to purchase some of the most advanced machines that are coming out of the Netherlands that are capable of producing these chips. Now, how does Chinese infiltration of European supply chains threaten our security here at home?
Congressman, it's a great question, and I think you bring up a very important dynamic, and this is something that we do continue to encourage our European allies to focus on, which is the economic security considerations, particularly as we look to strengthen the transatlantic industrial base on both sides of the Atlantic. This is a major consideration that would affect our ability to co-produce, co-develop, et cetera, with our European allies, and we want to be able to do that, but those conditions, certainly on the front on China, do impact our ability to do that, and so it's a consideration that we will continue to raise with them and encourage them to address so that we can develop together.
Sure, but is it just conversations right now?
That's all I can report on at this time. I'm sure my colleagues in acquisition and sustainment would have more to say on the tangible operational side because they deal with the technical exchanges, and so I would defer respectfully to them and their leadership and their expertise on that.
Very good. I have full confidence in the Trump administration to protect our key defense industrial base as well as our chip manufacturing that feeds so much into it. And General, thank you for your lifelong service, and I know it's going to continue afterwards. Especially when you become a veteran, but I appreciate all of what you've done to our country. And my question to you is regarding Europe, is Europe doing enough to control or to help the situation contain what's going on with the Houthis in Yemen?
So the EU has a mission called ASPIDES, which has ships in the Gulf to protect commercial shipping, sir. Obviously, the United States has felt the need to do the same alongside it. Together, it's hard for me to say if it's enough. I'd refer to General Kurilla, who follows that much more closely.
Sure. But we also know that the Russians have been helping the Houthis as well. Is that correct?
I'd like to answer that in closed session, please, sir.
No worries. And how much of the Iranian, Houthi, and Chinese threats to Europe, how much can that affect the United States?
I guess indirectly, it massively, directly. Probably we don't have that much shipping, I don't think, that comes through the Suez. However, our warships transit that all the time, so it would affect our ability to conduct military operations for sure. I'm not sure. I'm not an economist. I couldn't comment on how big the impact would be on us economically or something.
Thank you. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Sherrill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. General Cavoli, you said in your opening statement that Russia is in the process of significantly rebuilding its military by recruiting more soldiers, building more vehicles, and creating more munitions than we've seen before. So if the war in Ukraine were to end today, do you believe that the Russian military would continue to represent a significant threat to the U.S., Ukraine, and our European allies in the coming years?
Yes, ma'am. It would take them a little bit of time to reorient their conventional force and reposition it, but not that much time, and then they could pose a conventional threat. Very important for me to add, however, that they have never stopped having their strategic capabilities, their nuclear submarines, their long-range aviation, their cyber, their space. All of that is alive and well and largely unaffected by the war in Ukraine.
Thank you. And if Russia was able to retain and control significant portions of Ukrainian territory once the war ends, do you believe Russia would consider that a victory and consider launching a similar invasion of Ukraine or another European country in the future?
It's hard for me to predict the future, ma'am, but I think it's very safe for all of us to say that wouldn't prevent them from doing it in the future. It would certainly leave the door open for them. Yeah.
Thank you. And as the Trump administration chooses to abandon Ukraine and let Russia rebuild its military, they're also considering cutting the U.S. military presence in Europe. So, General Cavoli, how would cutting U.S. forces from USEUCOM impact your ability to respond to a crisis or potential conflict with Russia?
Ma'am, it would increase the amount of time it took to respond. It depends, of course, on what forces were hypothetically to be removed. It depends on what kind of action were required to counter Russia. But clearly, moving things to the other side of the Atlantic increases the time-space challenge. Other than that, I don't want to be evasive, but it's really a very situation-dependent question.
And would removing, I guess, to be more clear, our brigade combat team from Poland or having our forces stationed in Germany or Italy slow your response to a Russian assault on our Eastern European allies?
Yes, I've consistently testified to that.
Thank you. So as we move forward, can you just talk a little bit too, as you mentioned, about what you think the key strategic aspects are of Russia's military?
So in the broadest sense, ma'am?
That provide the biggest threat to the United States?
Yeah, their nuclear arsenal.
What about their cyber capabilities?
I believe their nuclear arsenal poses a bigger threat. Their cyber capabilities are more likely to be used, but in most cases wouldn't have the catastrophic effect that the nuclear threat would have. But of course, that again depends on what nuclear weapons we're talking about, what cyber attacks. But in general, I would say the nuclear capabilities, and then I would say the space and cyber, sort of on a level. But conventionally, their strategic advantage continues to be mass, that they can put in direct proximity to NATO forces that challenges us to respond in time across the spaces required. So basically, they can put a force into place that would cause us to have to react in a timely fashion. And that time-space problem is really the essence of conventional deterrence on the continent.
And given the recent conflict in Ukraine, what has been what will be the hardest for Russia to rebuild in the aftermath of that?
I'd like to answer that in closed session because it goes into some technical stuff. What I can say is I don't think it's that hard to rebuild their mass. They have manpower available. They demonstrate the willingness to conscript it, and it doesn't take that long to reconstitute the size of their old force or even to increase it. They still have equipment and storage that they could pull out and renovate, and they have increased their ability to produce legacy hardware, tanks and armored personnel carriers and things like that. So there are some things that are easy. The things that are hard, it'd be better to answer in closed session, ma'am.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair, and I'm recognized as a gentleman from Guam, Mr. Moylan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and as my colleagues did, I also would like to start in recognizing the 4 soldiers that were lost on March 25th in Lithuania. Mentioning their names, Staff Sergeant Troy Nuxam Collins of Battle Creek, Michigan, Staff Sergeant Jose Duenas of Juliet, Illinois, Staff Sergeant Edwin Franco of Glendale, California, and Private First Class Dante Titano, a son of Guam. These brave men were lost too soon in a tragic accident, and our hearts and thoughts and prayers go out to their families and loved ones during this challenging time. And I ask for my colleagues in the audience to please have a moment of silence. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And for my first question, General Cavoli, last year we had a discussion, and I thank you for that, and I truly appreciate, sir, your service. And I understand what you're going through with the USEUCOM, and you're doing a fantastic job, sir. And previously we talked about how the U.S. territories in the Pacific will seek their protection with Article 5, but that's not the case and would not. But however, Article 4 gives the authority for consultation and non-obligated support. Just want to know on your what the situation now we have with USEUCOM situation, our strategic situation. Are our allies, sir, still willing to support us in the Pacific? And with your experience through this situation, how can we better coordinate with your partners on security cooperation and international organizations and regional security in Pacific and Asia? General?
Thanks, Congressman. First, thanks for your kind words about our servicemen. Yeah, so many of our European allies have direct security interests in the Indo-Pacific. France has possessions there, the UK, so they have direct interest, and they do have military presences abroad there to help those up. They also do stage exercises in order to make sure they maintain the defense of their territories. They also worked very closely with the Department of Defense and with U.S. Indo-PACOM to coordinate occasional presence. A UK aircraft carrier is about to start a global mission. They are going to go through the Indo-Pacific. They are going to do so in close coordination with Admiral Paparo. So this gives us additional capacity out there as they come and go, and they continue to do that. However, the alliance is focused on the defense of the alliance territory as defined, as you pointed out, in Article 6. That does not prevent them from operating outside my AOR. SACIR's AOR does not include the United States, but the only time the alliance has declared Article 5 in its history was the morning after 9/11, when they declared that it was an attack on all of us and sent NATO AWACS planes to help our Operation Noble Eagle to defend our skies in the aftermath of those 2001 terrorist attacks.
Thank you, General. And also with the expansion of the ballistic missile system we have in UConn, I'm wondering, especially with the Aegis Ashore and the sites in Romania and Poland, the Golden Dome that we're looking at, what is this experience and these lessons learned that we can reflect to help us in the Indo-PACOM area?
So at an unclassified level, we're able to collect an awful lot of information about adversary rockets and missiles during the course of the conflict in Ukraine. A lot of that is given to us by our Ukrainian colleagues. You know, we gave them radars to defend themselves. They give us back invaluable data that we're able to study. So that's only one example, sir.
Thank you, General. Ms. Thompson, just one quickly. We just got a few seconds. Appreciate what SecDef is doing. And he went to UCOM for a specific reason. Where did he go next?
I believe he went to the Indo-Pacific.
That's right. I got to visit him there. Who was the last SecDef that came to the Indo-Pacific, to Guam, before our current Secretary of Defense?
I actually don't know off the top of my head, but I know it has to have been 10 years at least.
At least. It was Rumsfeld.
Oh, that's right.
I'm glad the interest of the United States for our Secretary of Defense is going from not just from the West Coast to the East Coast, but from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So I thank you. Thank you for your testimony, General. Sir, thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Cisneros.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to give my prayers and sympathies to the families of the service members who lost their lives. And General Cavoli, thank you for your years of service as you kind of approach the end of a fantastic career that you've had. So thank you, sir, for everything. So when I was Under Secretary of Defense for Personnel Readiness, I had a meeting with one of my counterparts from Latvia who was really concerned about how they could build up their reserves. I mean, to the point they were worried about the Russians and the possibility of them coming there, that they were actually drilling, you know, elementary school children, preparing military drill, ensuring that they're learning that in elementary school to get them ready as they matured and got older. Obviously, I think all the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, they're all very concerned about the Russians, and the invasion into Ukraine probably did not ease their tensions. But how are we preparing our Baltic allies, getting them ready for the possible threat of a Russian invasion? And really, and maybe this might be more for for the classified briefing, but what is the possible threat of later on if the Russians are successful in Ukraine, that they will continue their aggression on other former Soviet states?
Thank you, sir. So we help them in a variety of ways. First, how does NATO help them? NATO's new defense plans give a structure for them to plan and to nest their national defense plans inside. So those plans go together with the NATO plans, and this really helps a defense planner clarify a whole bunch of things about how much of what he needs where, et cetera, et cetera. Second, the command structures that have been outlined and the relationships that have been outlined as a result of the plans or inside the plans gives them permanent relationships for units to build readiness with and headquarters to build procedures with. So that's one big advantage that helps them a great deal. Bilaterally, we work very closely with those allies because they're so intent on buying American stuff. So it's one thing to buy a HIMARS. It's another thing to know how to use it. That's pretty simple. But it's another thing entirely to know how to integrate that capability into your warfighting methodology. And so, for example, I've got a battery of HIMARS, American HIMARS, in Estonia that's been working for well over a year and a half with them on how exactly they're going to incorporate their long-range fires into their operational methodology after this. I just was on the phone with I just received a letter from the Chief of Defense of Lithuania, who's interested in having a similar program, some sort of a HIMARS Academy. I could go on and on. On a third level, we also do special security assistance initiatives. So there's the Baltic Air and Missile Defense Initiative. There's the Baltic State Security Initiative. And those are focused appropriations for us to be able to help them buy the American stuff that matters to us. Focused on air and missile defense and domain awareness in the air right now, of course, because that's the most important thing. I guess I could go for hours. There's some classified things we do as well, Congressman.
All right. Ms. Thompson, can we still be confident that we're going to keep troops in Europe there and keep supporting NATO, that the United States will step up if, in fact, Russia does invade the Baltic states?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. On the first piece, I would just emphasize again, we're in the midst of a global posture review, so certainly we're taking these priorities and these considerations into our analysis as we conduct that. And then I would also emphasize the Secretary was very clear that we remain committed to NATO, and that includes all facets of the treaty. And so I would say yes. And I would also just add perhaps a bit of color to what General Cavoli was talking about specifically with the Baltics, and just emphasize that we have been so appreciative in this administration so far of how our Baltic friends acutely understand the threat perception, and we hope that, and we have encouraged our Baltic friends to communicate that threat perception to the Western and Central European powers, as well as we try to encourage the alliance as a whole to focus on defense spending.
All right, and then I got 30 seconds, but so very quickly, General Cavoli, you and your counterparts, INDOPACOM, AFRICOM, are always, I don't want to say at odds, but always fighting for assets to kind of come into your areas of your command and areas of operation there, responsibility. How are we kind of working through that to get to this point there to kind of make sure that we're not asking for too much, but, you're getting what you need?
Sure. So our job is to articulate our requirements based on the tasks we're given, sir, and the Secretary of Defense, with the advice of the chairman, allocates the resources. There's another step, though, right? Eric Carrilla and I have known each other our whole lives. We can communicate. There are things that I can do to help alleviate some of his challenges and vice versa. Mike Langley's headquarters is right next door to my headquarters in Stuttgart. We talk back and forth. And
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to add my condolences as well to those expressed by my colleagues of the family, loved ones and friends of the lost soldiers. And General Cavoli, from the home state of the First Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, I'd like to extend our congratulations and gratitude to you for your service, and would just note that we have had an unbroken line of American leadership at the top of NATO from its inception, and I, for one, expect and hope that's going to continue into the foreseeable future. But we are engaged in I'll call it a public rethinking of America's role in the world. Everybody in this room certainly spends their lives, their careers, their talents focused on this at a granular and strategic level every day, but because we've been effective at that for so long, many Americans have not had to engage in those discussions out and about, and their support is critical as we make the decisions that move us ahead. So with that in mind, General, I'd like to ask a couple of questions that are intended to inform the public discussion, not only the particularized discussion. Can you talk for a bit about the level of importance, the nature of importance of continuing to have a heavy ground presence on the European continent in terms of our security planning going forward, whether it's armor, infantry, or otherwise?
Sure, sir. So the alliance, we collectively require a heavy ground presence. That is specifically to be able to overcome that singular Russian advantage of being able to put its forces on our borders as an alliance before the initiation of hostilities. That causes a time-space problem for us in terms of reinforcing. So the positioning of this large force has to be appropriate to the situation, right, to the level of threat. Whether that ground force comes from America or someplace else is really, SACEUR doesn't care as long as it functions. There are some capabilities that the U.S. is very careful to make sure we continue to contribute because they're exquisite and in some cases unique, and we understand that, and those will have to be there all the time otherwise. So the question is, what is the preponderance of U.S. versus other nations' heavy ground force that is committed? That's something we balance all the time, and that's something that will change as our European allies pick up the capabilities targets we've just assigned them in the NATO defense planning process and commit the money that they've devoted in a profitable and a productive acquisition program to get the stuff they need.
Thank you, General. And at risk of sounding like I'm reading from the history books, I'm old enough to remember Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, and if my memory is correct, it was our ability to rapidly move the 7th Corps from Europe to the Middle East that allowed us to launch Desert Storm with the rapidity that we did. Can you speak a little bit, your point about whether there are American heavy ground forces or European allies in Europe, how does having American heavy ground forces pre-deployed in the European theater affect our planning and our ability to respond to American interests in the Middle East or in other proximate areas outside of Europe immediately?
It's fundamental to it, sir. There are three principal components of it's important to us: access, basing, and overflight. So our ability to base our forces someplace and to have the ability to access those forces to deploy them, and then to have the agreements to overfly nations. All of those things happen. They're usually based on pretty deep relationships. If you want it to be there when you need it, it's got to be, you have to have prepared for that moment. So those three things, access, basing, and overflight, are really a shorthand way of saying that gives us the ability to put forces forward in readiness, waiting to be deployed. Now, to what extent do we need to do that? That's largely a policy question, but that is the strictly military advantage of having forces forward for our own purposes. We do deploy them all the time. We've been, leaning toward and then backing off of non-combatant evacuation operations throughout the Mediterranean area for a couple of years. We provide forces on short notice to General Kurilla to be able to use in Central Command. I could go on, but I hope I've answered your question.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Goodlander.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by joining my colleagues in expressing my heartbreak over the loss of our 4 fallen service members and my sincere condolences to their families. I also want to join in expressing my gratitude to you, General, for your long and faithful service to our country. We don't agree always in Congress. We often disagree these days. But one thing I want to say at the outset is we've heard a lot of noise, but we've actually heard a lot of agreement in this hearing from across this dais. Agreement on basic principles and commitments that I think are worth reiterating because people from Warsaw to the Kremlin should hear it loud and clear. Does the United States of America have a national security interest, General, in the survival and the strength of the NATO alliance?
I believe it does.
And Ms. Thompson?
Yes, ma'am.
And what about the survival and strength of our European allies, including Ukraine?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I think it's important that we reiterate these basic principles. And General, could you elaborate on what is the nature of that national security interest that we have in the NATO alliance and in the survival and strength of Ukraine?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. So a lot of the interests are a lot of the benefits are rooted in common interests, common values, common histories, things like that. I'm not going to go into those just because that's subjective, debatable, and people have different opinions on it. As a military matter, some of the most advanced militaries in the world are in the NATO alliance. And some of the militaries in the world that we can be surest will work with us and are militarily interoperable with our forces are in the NATO alliance. It's surprising when you go outside of Europe how much the absence of something like NATO, the structures, the interoperability, is noticed immediately.
Thank you, General. This may be more for a closed setting, but you shared with us in your written testimony and several times today that Russia's war in Ukraine is the most visible sign of Moscow's great power ambitions. So I want to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about how you think about Vladimir Putin's ambitions. What would satisfy Vladimir Putin? Would taking the eastern half of Ukraine satisfy his ambitions, or would it embolden him?
Well, you know, I think if we go back and look at the history of his tenure as the president of Russia, you can follow his ambitions. They're pretty consistent, but they expand. Clearly, he's not yet been satisfied with the amount of Ukraine that he's taken over, because he's continuing to try to fight forward. How the conflict ends, you know, may disprove that. We don't know yet, but he certainly is interested in controlling the nations that are in his immediate neighborhood by whatever means necessary. And we've seen that demonstrated consistently over time. Could he stop tomorrow? We don't know.
General, you testified to the importance of our intelligence cooperation with our European allies and with Ukraine. You said that our ability to gather intelligence is enabled by enduring relationships that cannot develop episodically and that must be sustained. Can you, as someone who comes from the intelligence world, thank you for recognizing the important role that our intelligence cooperation plays. Is pausing our intelligence cooperation with European allies a good thing for America's national security?
No, we want continuous sharing of intelligence. We normally do it, as you know, ma'am, on a bilateral basis. We have very strong agreements with the nations in the alliance about bilateral intel sharing, and we're very grateful for it.
Was the pause last month in our intelligence cooperation and sharing with Ukraine helpful or harmful to America's interests in your area of operation, in your region?
That one I have to answer in closed session, ma'am, because I just have to answer that one in closed session.
Thank you, General. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes Gentlelady from Maryland, Ms. Elfreth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And General, I too echo my deep condolences for the lives lost and service members and their families, and echo my colleagues in congratulations and thanks. As the daughter of an entryman, he only retired as an FSC, but I greatly appreciate your 38 years of commitment to this nation's security. It doesn't go unnoticed from this committee, so thank you very much.
Not to correct you, ma'am, but there's no such thing as only an FSC.
I think my MLA might agree with you. So I want to dig in, General. You mentioned the contributions of our allies in your command, in EUCOM, such as Poland, as to the security of Europe and the subsequent security of this nation. You also mentioned Denmark as recently increasing its financial contributions here, but also critically expanding its patrol of the Arctic. Can you please just briefly expand on the importance of that particular allyship with Denmark?
Sure. Yeah, Denmark, ma'am, is one of our strongest allies. The bilateral relationship From the Danish perspective, is far and away their most important bilateral security relationship. I've known the Prime Minister of Denmark for quite a while, and she would initiate any conversation with that comment. They have been very reliable allies. They've got a high-tech military, not a big one, but it's high-tech. They have extremely competent special forces and naval special forces, and they contribute those liberally to the operations under my command as the Supreme Allied Commander. So, yeah, very strong ally. We love all our allies, but I would say that Denmark's a very strong one.
You don't have favorites, but I appreciate that. Ms. Thompson, reflecting on that, wouldn't you agree that the president's threats to possibly utilize military force to seize Greenland, a territory of Denmark, could only threaten that key allyship and, again, our shared ability to address the threats, particularly from Russia in the Arctic?
Thank you, Congresswoman. What I would say is I would focus on the bilateral relationship piece that General Cavoli hit on. I think that there's a lot of cooperation here, including on Greenland in particular, on the landmass. Particularly, we already have space capabilities there, and I think that there's opportunities. And the Secretary, in his pull aside with the Danish Minister of Defense, had a really positive conversation about where we could take the bilateral defense relationship. So I think there's room for growth and positivity there.
Okay. General, you've shared that Russia poses a chronic and growing threat, and that they are focused on a, quote, campaign of destabilization across your command. You also spoke about the intersection of how you work with the other combatant commands, particularly around the Mediterranean. I want to switch our conversation to yet another domain, that being of cyber. And can you help us better understand the cyber wars that Russia is waging against Ukraine, our allies in NATO, your command in Europe? And can you speak to your collaboration with Cyber Command, which is headquartered just a stone's throw from my district?
Yes, ma'am. I think the simplest way to get at this question is to describe roughly the two buckets in which we can consider Russian cyber operations to fall, right? Some of them are about the content. It's information operations, it's influence operations, it's the campaigns to spread their version of information around Europe and the world. Those are very, very active. Those don't necessarily involve cyber work, but can be injected through cyber vectors. But it can be as simple as a television channel. On the other hand, there's also the technical cyber work that they do, which is designed to penetrate our networks, to get into systems, to produce effects. Sometimes it's to take information, and sometimes it's to leave us problems. And they do a lot. I depend very, very heavily on U.S. Cyber Command through 16th Air Force in order to be able to combat those things and to help our allies combat them.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Thompson, wouldn't you agree that the continuity of leadership and expertise for any command, but particularly when it comes to combating cyber war, is essential to the security of EUCOM and our national security? Just yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. I would contend that the recent firing of a four-star general, commander of U.S. Cyber Command and National Security Agency Director General Timothy Howe, with no succession plan in place and no word of his replacement, poses a significant threat to EUCOM, Ukraine, NATO, and our homeland. Can you please speak, Ms. Thompson, briefly to the Secretary's timeline in announcing the replacement for Cybercom?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. I have to say I'm not privy to those decisions, and it's outside of my jurisdiction in international security affairs. What I would say is, obviously, Cybercom, as you've pointed out, is essential to not only the EUCOM AOR, but also Homeland Defense, which is a major priority. So I would just leave it there. Thank you.
I would contend this is an astonishing volatility and lacking continuity. It's posing a real threat, unnecessary threat to our national security. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Tran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I, too, am very saddened by the loss of our soldiers, and I send my condolences to their family. General, I salute and thank you for your years of service. Thank you so much, and appreciate you both being here to testify today. Tariffs have been in the news a lot lately, with President Trump levying tariffs against our allies and adversaries alike. Like many people, I am deeply concerned about how these attacks will impact our military and diplomatic partnerships with our closest allies and partners. Ms. Thompson, with the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs on EU goods, which I expect could disrupt global supply chains critical to American defense manufacturing, how is UCOM preparing for possible delays for cost increases in defense equipment sourced from Europe?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I'll start by saying, and again, I want to say this very respectfully, I'm not trying to be evasive, it's just the effects of tariffs specifically on the diplomatic relationship side or on the economic side are a little bit outside of my jurisdiction. What I would say from the defense perspective is we are acutely focused on making sure that we can have a strong transatlantic industrial base on both sides of the Atlantic, which includes reforms on both sides of the Atlantic. We certainly want the European Union to be open to continuing to partner with the United States as the defense relationship goes. And both of us, both the European Union and ourselves, have reforms that we need to make to ensure that the economic environment in the defense industrial base context is certainly robust enough that we can make successful investments together.
But you do recognize that these strains will cause an effect on our industrial base, yes?
It's something that we will be looking at and taking into consideration as we pursue the defense industrial base effort in particular.
Right. General, what measure is UCOM taking to address potential strains in defense collaboration and ensure joint operational effectiveness?
So we continue with our exercise programs. We continue with our consultations with our allies. We continue to work very closely. UCOM continues to work very closely with NATO, with the Allied Command operations, and we move forward just in a straight military fashion, sir.
And as European nations aim to enhance their defense industries and reduce dependency on U.S. arms, how does UCOM assess the potential impact on NATO's collective defense posture?
Well, first, we need our allies to rearm in general. If they rearm with stuff, we want them to rearm with equipment that works with ours. In many cases, the easiest way to do that is to buy U.S. So during the course of this conflict, Congressman, the orders, the value of foreign military sales orders, that is our allies' orders to buy American equipment, have increased by 600%. There right now are 4,000 sales cases worth $265 billion that European nations are lined up to buy from the United States as arms manufacturers. As the Allied commander, I encourage that, right? I want more capability and capacity as fast as we can get it.
Have you seen any impacts of the recent tariffs impacting the 600% increase in those sales?
Sir, I have not. I have been here for the last week and a half testifying to the Senate and now here.
The deepening strategic partnership among China, Russia, Iran, North Korea pose an increasing challenge for the United States and its allies in Europe. I'm particularly concerned by Russian and Chinese economic and military partnership causing strain on individual European countries within the NATO alliance. General, how is UCOM working with European partners to deter or expose CCP efforts to fragment NATO cohesion through strategic investments?
Sure, sir. The first way is through intel sharing. Right, we have a number of different, we have many bilateral intel channels, but we also have a few lesser known multilateral intel sharing fora. And in those, we talk about these things. The Department of Defense, UCOM, also works closely with our State Department colleagues in missions throughout the alliance because they really have the lead in helping our allies avoid malign Chinese investments. Finally, as I mentioned to a member earlier, our exercise program specifically uses infrastructure that we want to be sure of the reliability of. So we vary what we do and where we do it so that we're always testing the reliability of our infrastructure. And when we find a problem, we talk to our host nation about it right away.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Ms. Thompson. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Bill of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the ranking member. Ms. Thompson, General Cavoli, thank you for being here. And also, General, I want to add to the chorus of thanking you for 38 years of service. I would be remiss if I did not express my deepest condolences to the families of the 4 service members who tragically lost their life serving our nation in Lithuania. But again, thank you for your service. And on behalf of my district in the St. Louis region, we want to thank you. And since you got a little time, if you ever want to come out, we're known for beer. You can have that now, right? We're known for that in Cardinals game. So while our European allies have been working to increase their defense spending to meet the 2% NATO defense spending target, the administration's recent decision to impose tariffs on nearly every NATO country and allied partner could undermine these efforts and potentially slow our collective progress. General Cavoli, how do you foresee these tariffs impacting the defense spending of our European allies?
You know, I don't know, Congressman. Sir, in an economic sense, I'm not an economist, so I can't walk through the trail of how it'll work. I do know that our allies are determined to increase their defense capability and capacity, no matter where they buy things from or no matter how they get it. That is nearly a universal sentiment in the alliance right now. And to spend more than 2%, as you go around, you hear a lot of that.
And are these countries now less likely to meet the 2% target due to these tariffs? And will this hurt our European allies, including the Baltic states, who outspend the U.S. As a percentage of GDP?
Sir, if they're unable to access our market or if they have to pay more than expected for equipment, certainly that's going to affect how much capacity they can build, how quickly. I don't know how the tariffs will exactly do that, though.
In the past 6 months, Russian and Chinese ships have been implicated in sabotaging undersea cables. This comes as no surprise given Russia's ongoing efforts to target Ukrainian power cables, telecom links, and gas pipelines since its invasion of Ukraine in 2022. General, how is European Command addressing the threat of sabotage or disruption of undersea cables in European waters, and what steps are being taken to mitigate the risks posed by state actors, particularly Russia and China?
So European Command, sir, first, as with some of the other responses, shares intelligence when we get intelligence on this to support our allies as they defend their own infrastructure. We also defend our own U.S. critical infrastructure that's overseas. Interestingly, the biggest collective defenses of critical national infrastructure don't involve the U.S. hardly at all. So last year, I started an operation called Baltic Sentry, where we brought together under NATO command voluntarily donated ships and crews, as well as coastal defense radars from the Baltic allies, the allies in the Baltics and the Nordics, and we sewed those together into a single operation that surveils and increases our understanding of what's going on the surface and below the surface of the Baltic Sea. For the longest time, there were no U.S. ships involved in that. There are no U.S. ships involved in it today. I think I have 40 Marines who temporarily helped with a couple of radars, and I think they may have departed already. So this is an example of our allies taking that upon themselves as they should, and happily.
And if I could get one more question in general, can you discuss the implications if the administration withdraws U.S. troops from Syria? How might this affect our counterterrorism efforts in the Eastern Mediterranean?
So it would mainly, from my perspective, affect our ability to collect intelligence, and I have to leave that at that in open session, sir. You know, I concern myself very much with the Russian presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. That has been greatly weakened.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Whitesides.
Thank you, General.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here at this pivotal time for U.S. interest in Europe. Obviously, this is a time of immense change in your AOR, the shifting U.S. posture, the continuing war in Ukraine, not to mention the recent additions to the NATO alliance. It's clear to many of us on this committee that continued strong support for Ukraine is not only vital to U.S. security interests, but to the continued strength and vitality of our alliances and partnership in Europe. General Cavoli, in the years since Putin's unprovoked invasion, I've been heartened to see that former Soviet states who had previously been deferential to Russia were beginning to push back on Putin's bullying tactics. Obviously, the U.S. posture towards Ukraine has changed a great deal in the last 3 months. In your opinion, how would a U.S. withdrawal from global leadership in support of Ukraine impact these smaller nations' ability to demonstrate independence from Russia? Specifically, in your opinion, will it have an impact on the democracy movement in Belarus?
Congressman, it's a great and important question. A lot of answering it would go well outside of my my wheelhouse. I will say that all nations are watching very closely what the U.S. does any place all the time. We're such a mover on the global stage that everybody's constantly observing and calculating against that. That's especially true in those states that have the opportunity to get out from under Russia's shadow. Armenia would be an excellent example of that. So they're watching closely.
Thank you, sir. On a similar note, I wanted to ask you about the following subject. So Putin's regime is constantly engaged in egregious cybercrime and offensive cyber operations against us, our allies, against companies, infrastructure, you name it, which is why I was very distressed to hear that this administration initiated a pause on offensive cyber operations against Russia. I'm honestly at a loss to understand how giving Putin's cyber criminals a free pass serves our national security or economic interests. General, does a cessation of offensive cyber operations, either temporarily or ongoingly against Russia, create any risk for our troops and operations in Europe?
Sir, any details would have to be spoken about in closed session, of course. The cessation that you're talking about did not pose risk to my troops. If they had, I would have made that clear immediately.
Thank you, sir. I just want to say on behalf of Congress and the nation, we're so grateful for your service, and you are what makes America great. So thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, thank you so much for being here, sir. You have tremendous service to our country. I'm an old Army guy, enlisted. I wanted to be Navy, but my ASVAB scores were too high. So I appreciate your service, and it just can't be it can't be overstated, the debt that our country has to you, your family. So many decades of sacrifice. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Since you're a former enlisted member of the service, I should point out that Sergeant Major Abernathy, sitting right behind me, is leaving after many years of service this year as well. And we thank him for it.
Well, NCO is always quite certain that if the officers don't show up, eventually somebody will notice. But if the NCOs don't show up, well, the Army's in trouble. So, General, Ukraine, I'd just like to chat with you about Ukraine. And if you could, for America and for some members of this committee that need clarity, could you describe from your perspective, which is quite unique and experienced, what does victory look like? Can you share with us how you would envision victory? Should we continue to invest American treasure to seek some resolution of the Ukrainian war and Russian invasion of Ukraine? Clearly, we seek some definition of victory. Could you possibly share that?
Absolutely, Congressman. And without getting into the realm of policy, which Ms. Thompson is obviously much better prepared to talk about than I think you have to start by saying victory for whom, right? And whose victory? What does a good outcome for the United States look like is one part of that.
Okay.
What does a good outcome for Ukraine look like? When you think about Ukraine, you can think about it in increments. The first step to winning is not losing, right? So Ukraine has to defeat Russia's efforts to continue to take their territory. Then after that, you have a national question: how much of it do we want to take back, and what is the cost-benefit analysis of what it will take to take that back? And I think the Ukrainians calculate that every day and plan against that every day. So, it's a complicated question, but I think an important part of it is we have to ask ourselves, what are the benefits for us in the various outcomes?
So to the gentleman's point, and thank you for sharing your perspective there in this setting. You're limited in how you can respond, I'm quite sure. But it's important for America to observe that we do seek resolution of this war. And this Congress and this committee in particular carries quite a heavy burden on making responsible decisions on behalf of the American people that we represent. So defining victory to some of us at this point has become as clear as just a cessation of war, the cessation of the killing. And for some of us, it was difficult to envision any scenario where Ukraine defeats Russia. This seems to be a fantastic projection of the wildest imaginations of what potentials could be. So sustaining the war, it would be sustaining the killing of Ukrainian men and women and the destruction of Ukrainian territories. And it seems to us that Russia can bear the brunt of this conflict for quite a long time. And I would ask the good lady's perspective of, hey, give us a window on ending this thing, and how can we look forward to some sustained peace in a way that Ukraine could measure some prevail.
Thank you, Congressman. And I can certainly provide additional color to this in our closed session from a policy perspective. But President Trump, as you've rightly hit on, his goal is to end it as soon as possible. And that's why we're undergoing the peace process that's currently in discussion. And I would say, again, the goal is to end that peace process in an enduring fashion so that we're not at this table again in the short, medium, or long-term period of time.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My time has expired.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bidman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to pass on my condolences to you, the entire USEUCOM family, and the families of the fallen 4 dog-faced soldiers from 3rd ID. That's a tremendous loss. Next, I want to say, as a retired Army officer myself, I want to congratulate you on your upcoming retirement and recommend avoiding electoral politics if you want peace and quiet. Right now, our adversaries are challenging the United States' interests around the globe, and Russia's continued illegal war in Ukraine is far from over. In your written testimony, you focused on the chronic threat that Russia poses to the United States and the importance of land deterrence. And it's been a really persistent threat for decades now, in one iteration or another, from the Soviet Union to the present. General Cavoli, how many troops do we need in Europe to deter Russia at its current end strength?
Sir, our current capacity is deterring Russia right now. Of course, the answer to that question always depends on where Russia goes in the future, right? How do they configure themselves? Where do they place themselves? What are their intentions? For what we're doing right now, it's obviously working, but they're quite occupied elsewhere. I would point out, I wouldn't measure it also strictly by end strength, the numbers of human beings. It really comes down to what capabilities are we able to bring to bear, how quickly, and how does that nest in to the alliance's efforts, which are evolving and increasing. So over time, I would expect our contribution to drop. It's going to take some time, however.
So I want to address the issue that my colleague from Louisiana just discussed, and kind of part of what victory looks like is a free and sovereign and secure Ukraine. Right? And so far that has come at no cost in American lives as far as uniformed service members, although there have been obviously many volunteers that have gone over and felt the need was great and sacrificed tremendously. In the context of of my definition and kind of how you see victory. Is victory for Ukraine possible?
Congressman, not losing is definitely possible, and I think that's the first step.
So if we're talking about a free, secure, sovereign Ukraine, the actions that we've taken so far, I mean, they've not lost yet, but how do we take it to the next level? If we want to get a meaningful peace that provides for a free, sovereign, secure Ukraine, what do we need to do in addition to what we've done so far?
Well, I think there's a military contribution to that, sir, of course, but I think that the principal questions would probably be outside of my lane.
Well, I'm talking in your purview, and briefly, obviously, do we need to provide them more stuff?
We need to continue to provide them the defensive mechanisms to prevent the heinous attacks that we've
provide
seen.
More intelligence?
Intelligence, air defense weapon systems, and then artillery systems and ammunition. Those are always the important things that they need.
Those will pressure Russia to come to the negotiating table in a more balanced fashion to achieve the victory that I described, which is a free, secure, and sovereign Ukraine.
Those could be a contributor to that effort.
Okay. I want to transition a little bit and talk about, you mentioned your relationships going back decades with your counterparts in different COCOMs, General Carrillo, for instance. There are other relationships that, for instance, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I'm sure you've known him, you worked with him, you closely coordinate with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with the functional combatant commanders like Cybercom, with the senior advisor to NATO. Those folks have all been fired in the last couple of months. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And so have you ever seen this type of sort of chaos or sort of lack of coordination in your 38 years? Have you ever had to deal with that kind of shuffling of personnel that are your counterparts that help enable your mission?
I have had to deal with shufflings and things like that before, yes, sir.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good to see you again, General. It's been a couple years now that we've known each other, and I've seen you around the world, several different places. I know you're going to miss dealing with crayon-eating Marines and better-looking uniforms, I might add, better commercials. But with that said, it's interesting. The first time I ever saw you at a hearing, I asked you a very specific question about, can we win in Ukraine? You said, you didn't even hesitate. You said, absolutely. And I agree with you. And for those people who are doubters, I make the case, first of all, that we have, between us and Europe, we have a $50 trillion economy versus two. We control sanctions. We control the economy. We control energy production. And we can undermine Russia in so many ways economically, not even to mention militarily. Germany has a $5 trillion economy versus 2 for Russia. There should be no competition here. But the problem is, when we went to command and staff, when we went to go to Water College, when we do all our advanced training, we always learn how to execute a war, full-throated, not half-assed, not going partial measures, and then drawing it out like we have every war since Korea, in my opinion. We did this with Iraq. We did it with Afghanistan. We continued to draw it out. We went half measures, and it went way too long. And I feel like we're doing the same thing here. Instead of just saying, all in, end this thing, within 1 year, it's over. That's Clausewitzian warfare. Now, of course, we take nukes off the table. I understand the deterrence there. But do you think we still, a year after we had our first conversation, a couple of years after we had our first conversation, do you still think that what I just said is viable and has application in this process to ending this war?
I do, sir. The role of assistance to Ukraine, the pace of assistance to Ukraine, the magnitude of it, has an outsized impact in this in this war.
So, Ms. Thompson, I just say, if I could give you feedback to the president. These are two military guys who've been in this business for a long time, and actually there's a whole lot more than that. We can end this war in many ways. I love what the president's doing to put pressure on Russia to end this, but he's in the power seat. He's the most powerful man in the world. With sanctions, with energy production, the things he's doing, also with the development of our businesses there, which Russia would have a hard time attacking if we're there. But also the fact that the president has been very strict in saying, hey, I got the bigger button. I have the bigger military. I have more economic power than anybody in the universe. We can end this. The president is the big man in the room. And I would love to see him put pressure on Putin because he has that leverage. Getting back more to tactics and away from strategy, we have new munitions. We have the glide bombs. We have wire-guided munitions now, very similar to what the TOW is, but they have loitering capacity with the new drones. What are we doing to both develop that and also counter that in technologies? Obviously, you're not going to talk about anything classified, but do you feel like we're moving at pace for our newly developed weapon systems?
Yeah, Congressman, a general never feels like we're moving at an adequate pace when it comes to development of new weapon systems, especially in conflict. We continue to help our Ukrainian partners in their development of this stuff, but they have really, they've become the world experts in one-way drones, and they are very, very good at it. They're also very good at countering it, and are doing that. Our ability to learn from them is an important thing. A few minutes ago, a member asked about lessons learned and how we're incorporating those. One of the if you can find a silver lining in this tragic dark cloud of this war, we are learning an awful lot about the future of warfare and about Russia's capabilities as well.
I think that I have great applications to Taiwan and the Straits as well when we're talking about legacy systems versus the newer technologies that are going to impact the battlefield. I'm almost out of time, but I want to take this time as you're nearing retirement just to say that no matter what happens, no matter how bad your uniform looks compared to the Marines or anything like that, you have one thing that you can always hang your hat on, and you have the coolest title ever, Supreme Allied Commander. Nobody can take that from you for the rest of your life. God bless you, Semper Fidelis. Good luck in your next career.
Thank you, sir.
With that, I yield, sir.
Gentlemen yields. We will now conclude this open session and take up the closed session in room 2212 at 10 minutes after 1 o'clock. We're adjourned.